These questions of archive, these questions of sort of authorship and synthesis of knowledge are tremendously important in the realm of conservation. If we look across, not just sort of northeastern Syria, not just around Middle East and North Africa, but really around the world right now, one pattern that we might see is that many archaeological sites that were excavated 100 years ago or more are actually right now, it's only been maybe the last 20 or 30 years, that increasingly there's another kind of practice that is engaging, another revisiting of those same sites with similar intentions, but ultimately some very different objectives. Those practitioners are largely not thinking about their work as being a continuation of a research mission. And even though indeed there are likely to be discoveries along the way as they engage with a particular site and engage with conservation interventions. But instead, they're really, the logic is really, it starts from a point of view of public presentation. It starts from a point of view of recognizing these sites as community resources that are enjoyed by a living public, local or international or both. And as such, a lot of that exercise, beyond sort of seeking technical solutions to technical problems on site, trying to find ways to help walls stand stronger for a longer period of time, trying to find ways to have water flow, in a better way and prevent damage on site. It is a question of curating narratives. It is always a question of choosing which aspects of the site are more legible and which aspects of the site are somehow obscured or not in the same prominence. And, in order to make those choices, there's no there is no other resource other than typically the work of our colleagues in field archaeology. If those sites have a long history of excavation and exploration, then absolutely. I mean, one of the first exercises that any one of these conservation projects will get engaged with, particularly if they have the liberty to be engaged on site for many years, is a lengthy process of sort of synthesis of existing research, some of the very same annotated bibliography that we've seen on some of the websites this morning. And in particular, looking for, some archival resources for that community are particularly important. And I would say, photographs here over the last 100 years, photographs of archaeological sites, the richness of information that we gain from those archival photographic collections now really indicates just how much value people 100 years from today might gain from the well-organized data-rich environments that we saw this morning. And the question or proposition that I have for all of you, it relates to this fact that that control of narrative is one that any one of us might assume that reluctantly, recognizing that the past is a complicated thing, recognizing that indeed, even as you gather all of the facts from the field and put them into a well-organized and sort of cross-reference database environment, that the process of synthesizing that into narrative is one, subject to interpretation and is one subject to debate. And in the longer view, as we review sort of the last, 100 years of field archaeological practice at many of the sites, I will say from the perspective of conservation, in too many cases, we find that those efforts for synthetic narrative to be lacking, at this distance in time, when so many of the people who are actively involved in the excavation are no longer with us. when what we have are, again, resources that are more scarce than what we saw this morning. I mean, distinctly more scarce. So, yes, the occasional field notebook, yes, the occasional sort of preliminary publication of finds. But, for all of us who have been in the field and known that joy of excavation and just the energy that it takes to continue that process going, I think we all can easily admit that that as a practice, it is all too common to have sort of preliminary findings published, but the final synthetic manuscript never quite done. Many of us are probably familiar with sites where we know that tragic story in details, really kind of too great to go into, where unfortunately, at the very moment where somebody had really set aside time in their life to undertake that huge effort of bringing together a lifetime's worth of work on site, that somehow the baton dropped at that very critical moment, and that work was never fully completed. And indeed, those people in the orbit of that same work, where there's maybe some hope that they would undertake that effort on their own, the exigencies of their own scholarship and their own life has meant that it hasn't been possible to simply spend all of that effort, working through the archives of a given project and bringing it into a more published or synthesized form. We've seen that trend now. I mean, that is a long-standing trend in the field that where we can, yes, we're no longer moving as much, dirt in a country like Egypt as we were 100 years ago, and this is all for the best. And indeed, the Supreme Council of Antiquities in Egypt would be the first ones to say that that's true. But if those who are doing the excavation, if that longstanding sort of reluctance, or in many cases, that threshold of synthesis has not been achieved, prior to the end of the effort of a given project. One thing that we are seeing actually now in many cases is that as that conservation effort begins and unfolds on site, it actually winds up typically this other team that wasn't necessarily involved with the initial excavation at all. They are ultimately taking those choices, perhaps reluctantly, perhaps very eagerly and gladly, but they in many cases at a remove of many decades from the original research and the original excavation, they're simply making the choice on the basis of whatever material is available, those ultimate choices of how to synthesize the narrative in a way that is legible in the material environment and that is presentable to a broader public. So that's our reality as it's operating right now, as I've seen it play out in many contexts. And I think the question for all of us, one of the things that comes out of what we saw this morning is just, it prods us to think, well, we're getting these richer, much richer sources, which without a doubt, as conservation continues to unfold, conservation has been baked into the DNA of the Mozan project in a way that's quite exceptional. But we can already anticipate that there will be a time, whether it is, just a handful of years from now, whether it's a handful of decades from now, when another group is in fact trying to engage with, the material that all of you have been working to bring together. And, I will put it to you that potential audience, it's a near certainty that they will exist. And indeed, I think it must be one of your primary audiences that you keep in mind as this work continues to unfold, because that, the circumstances in Mozan right now are not very favorable for international collaboration in terms of a field-based approach, and continuing to do, some of the ambitious, more ambitious plans for conservation on site. And those conditions, we could hope for and should continue to hope for improvement sooner rather than later. But as you work on these archives and as you work to kind of create a trail of breadcrumbs for others to follow, and particularly as you work on these thematics, where I think that some of these themes that the headings of themes where a lot of the synthesis is really occurring in these web materials. I encourage you as a community to be the ones that make some of those narrative choices now, rather than leaving it to another group that might come at some time, some unknown time in the future, grappling with all of the challenges of re-engaging with the material. And this is, again, I mean, you've created one of the most accessible and exhaustive site-based archives that we have in recent memory, particularly for the scale of a site like Mozan, which is large, but not nearly as large as some of the the other sites in the region that have I mean, again, bibliographies that have been created by multiple expeditions over hundreds of years. So there's something quite discrete that you're working with, and where you have a great degree of possibility in transmitting this message to that other group, or hopefully some of us even now in the room will really be a part of this too. But we really don't know. I mean, Mozan really forces us to ask those questions of just admitting how little control we have over those outcomes, those potential outcomes in the future. And in those places where some of the most important trends that you've identified in your research are legible in the material fabric, those are tremendous opportunities. And I think a lot of that already exists in some of the didactic materials that are already on site at Mozan. But I also think that here, in this kind of prolonged period of disconnection between the part of the Mozan team that's in Mozan, the part of the Mozan team that is not in Mozan, it's afforded the time for additional thinking, for additional cross-referencing of this information, for new discoveries and insights. And it is because of the enthusiasm that you've seen in the Mozan community for engaging with the site, for receiving some of these messages. I think that is perhaps the most powerful rationale for continuing this kind of effort and work, even if it feels like in any given day the details, you're working with details that were first, entered into the system in 2001, 20 years ago, and the memories of that day might feel distant. But the audience is there to receive it, and this phase of sort of synthesis, conservation, presentation, it really is intended for a living audience that is even alive now today and will continue to be alive and thriving in years to come. And that audience, as much as much of this morning's conversation, we were often trying to imagine how it is in a realm of peers and other scholars, how some of this material might continue to advance those conversations. I'll just say that in the realm of conservation, that is one of several audiences that is generally sort of dictating outcome, and we can certainly imagine without too much difficulty a moment in the near future of Syria where there's some real mandate for that kind of work under a new governmental framework, and according to principles that we might not fully know about now or be able to control. So keeping, working on those efforts of synthesis, working on these efforts of some key thematics that seem to be exemplified in the site in certain locations, those are the things that will, the more the work happens on that front now, the greater likelihood that those most important messages will really be transmitted to this audience that's already eager to receive it, and where, because of all of the hard work at Mozan for so many years, and because of this unique, sort of ongoing collaboration between the Mozan community in Mozan and the Mozan community not in Mozan, accepting that responsibility and accepting that control of narrative, I think is really imperative. I mean, it's something where, as we, one of the greatest deficits as I look back over the last 100 years of field archaeology is that there's been there's been too much reluctance, honestly, to accept that same responsibility. And I think because of the nature of the Mozan community as you've created it and the different geographies and the different contributors, you know, I think that there's sort of no better basis for an earnest pursuit of that successful outcome.
Great.
C'era una chiavetta. Ah, ce l'avevamo già sul desktop.
Sì, troppo, c'è troppo. Anche il mio PowerPoint.
Quale?
Quella che aveva presentato
Stamattina, sì.
Michele, devi ricondividere lo schermo.
Sì, un attimo. Ok, l'altro l'ho cercato. Sì, c'era stamattina.
Quella trovi la presentazione. La tua presentazione, se mi prendi il punto dove c'era la tua presentazione di oggi.
Ah, no, non ce l'ho più.
Ah, non
C'è la sulla chiavetta, professore.
No, non la ricordo.
Vabbè, però le proietto.
Non importa.
Ok, allora proietto
Tanto me la
questo.
ricordo bene, se non so ricordare.
E un attimo.
Avrò un'evocazione a parole di una figura.
Ok.
Ormai non hai l'accento italo-americano, parli italiano, cazzo. Cioè, da volta c'è un accento italo-americano che non ce l'è. Grazie. Allora, grazie prima di tutto, grazie per l'invito. Mi presento un attimo, non perché niente di importante da dire, tanto per come mai sono qui. Dunque, io sono... ho fatto il liceo classico in Italia, che per quelli della mia generazione vuol dire qualcosa. I did high school in classic studies that in Italy somehow it was important at the time. That's my cultural heritage training, liceo classico. Then when I decided between humanities and science, I decided science for living and humanities for my own pleasure, because I thought that professional work in humanities was difficult or not paying enough. And then I studied physics in Italy, which is also important from a point of view. Then computer science at UCLA. That's why I was very glad that Giorgio invited me, because UCLA for me is like a long time ago. And something 50 years ago exactly, so it's my celebration, I did graduate in physics, but with the thesis on relational databases. And there was the first thesis on relational database, I think, worldwide. Now, if you know the story, I was given 5 papers to read. 4 papers were very technical, so I didn't understand anything. The 5th paper was the paper by Ted Code about relational database, was the only paper I understood, because it was conceptual. So I did the thesis on relational databases, and it was the first worldwide probably to be a thesis on the subject, which means I work on data modeling, information modeling since 50 years ago. And what I can see from the discussion of today is that the world did not change. The issues are still the same of 50 years ago. So I think the subject, my slides are obsolete now because the discussion of today went differently. So I will not use them, probably not marginally. The subject is information modeling, information representation, and information usage. So what you do in archaeology is not at all different from any field worldwide. All the fields have exactly the same problem. Now, I evoke the picture by George also was used about the different planes, the multilinear. I agree with the term multilinear versus non-linear. But with respect to if you remember that picture, there were several planes, several paths on that plane, on each plane. Now, that picture is simplified respect to reality in a number of ways. First of all, the paths intersect each other. They're not independent. So on each plane, the paths intersect. This is the old ideas of Vannevar Bush. Someone mentioned today Vannevar Bush. Hypertext, the name hypertext was invented by Ted Nelson in the 50s, but the idea started from Vannevar Bush. But Vannevar Bush did not meant the hypertext as we know today. The idea of Vannevar Bush is multilinear. Trails, he called them trails, is what you call multilinear. The definition of Vannevar Bush is, I follow a trail. The problem is the same piece of information belongs to different trails. That's why they intersect. He was working for the American government. His idea is I have an invoice about delivery of something. Now, the same node, that invoice is part of accounting trail, but is also part of equipment, is also part of Texas deposit. So the same node belongs, the problem is trail intersect. That's where it comes to navigation, because the same trail intersect, which means I start on a trail. If I follow the trail, it's not that difficult. The problem is when I get to a node that belongs to different trail, I can start. First of all, I realize that there are other trails. Secondly, I may come to my mind to follow another trail instead of keep going on the old trail. And then I can get another intersection, I can start another trail. Then maybe I want to go back to an old trail and restart. So I have multiple positions. Where I am is very difficult to define. But bear in mind that each experience by user is linear. Although your map is not linear, if I follow what the user does, of course, it's a linear path in the sense it went here, here, and there. So there is a difference between the multilinearity of representation and linearity of the experience. Readers are like we speak. We always speak linearly. Take James Joyce. Although semantically, what he says is very confused, but the speech, the text is linear. So a reading experience is, so that's the point, by the way. There is a mismatch by the linear experience that's implemented over a non-linear representation of information. And there are no two readers doing, if I have only linear representation, all the readers go the same way. But if you have a multilinear representation, each reader has a different way of reading. So the first simplification in the picture by Giorgio is on the same plane, linear intersect. There is a second simplification. He made parallel planes, but parallel actually plane intersect. They cross each other. So there is no, I think plane can be discipline like sociology, economic, history, or whatever. That could be a way to associate meaning to planes, but this plane intersect means several things. the same, nominally same path may belongs to different plane. For example, the sequence of history of the sequence of civilization in the Middle East, I can read it from a sociological point of view, economic point of view, historical. So the plane intersect. The third simplification is the notion of node is very ambiguous. So this is an object. Give me a description of this object. If you give me a physical description, you give me a description. If you give me a sociological description, you give me another description. If you give me an economic description, it's another one. Historically, this was the water bottle that Jesus used in somewhere in Jericho. It's totally different. So the notion is the same node, it's very ambiguous. Actually, the node is never the same, because if I get to the same node with different plane or a different path, I get something different. Of course, the reader may be interested in switching point of view. Although I stumble into this object for one mental process, I may be interested in switching to another mental process. So going from economic to sociology, from sociology to history to excavation. So the picture is good, but it's a little bit of simplification versus reality. The reality of representation is more complex, not of readership. So what I think I disagree is the reader should not see this complexity. This is the complexity for designer of information. Each reader should have a reasonable way to read this. It means staying on a plane, staying on one of the paths. This is the normal reader. The normal reader does not see this complexity. The normal reader should read one way of reading this material. One way. The more sophisticated reader may have several points of view. Another sophisticated reader may like to switch from one plane to another plane, from one path to another path, but this is very sophisticated reader already. But he's never the designer. So don't confuse the way you represent information because you generate them from the way the people read the information. Even expert readers, by the way, it's not just lay people versus experts. So the process of reading is different from the process of creating the information. So after we have three processes: creating the information, organizing them, the process of designing the pieces, technically representing the information. So when you excavate, you create information. You create. When you organize this information, you represent information. When I read, it's totally different. Now, because when I read, we were discussing before, there is no optimal way of reading. The optimal process would be, I read the information exactly as I need. Not the way you see it, but the way I should. Now, the way I should see it depends on my culture, on my background, on my purpose of reading the information, and also from the, if you want, accidental type of, do I want to see a video? Do I want to read the text? I mean, kind of mediality of user experience. So separate the process of creation of information, representing the information, reading the information. You cannot pretend that the reader has exactly your point of view that you create the information. The reader is the reader. It may happen, the problem is you are a reader of your information, honestly. So if you read your information, you are a very specific reader. The reader is coincident with the creator of the information. So somehow you want to read the way you create the information, but the normal reader that did not participate to the process of creation is a reader. And if you take, I give you some trivial, some simple example. If you take a museum like National Gallery of Washington, for example, but all the museums are the same, they have guided tours to go through the material. Now, if you take any painting, the Adorazione dei Magi, for example, by Botticelli, it's not easy to find out, but they have 3-4 different descriptions. One is general description of the painting. The other one, there is a very interesting guided tour, patrons and artists in Italy. So they give you a different interpretation of the same object, because in that guided tour, the narrative is different. Then they have another guided tour. So for each time you put the node in a path, in principle, you can give a different interpretation, which makes sense for that tour, for that path. So that's the complexity of the situation. This is, there is no narrative associated to an object. There are several narratives corresponding to the possible way to get there. Of course, in practice, we try to write one interpretation, hoping one narrative, trying to be good for everyone. But in principle, so if I go to this room, am I an architect, you give me an architectural description. If I go to the room, I'm a pedagogist, you describe the setting, pedagogical setting. So there is not one description of this room. We say in informatics, opportunistic. Opportunistic means there is not real description. Is the description good for this purpose? There is nothing like the description. Another point for me of disagreement is no one understands the whole world. Each one actually understands only one plane, one path. No one really, only God perceives the world. Everybody else perceives, like as a human being, we perceive reality our own way. You cannot claim that our perception is reality. Reality is something else. It's our own perception. So this is the same for information. Every time you create a path, you create a description, is an opportunistic path, is an opportunistic description. If you put all the possible paths together, as a complexity that we don't care, in the sense, who cares? It's such complexity that no one really dominates the complexity. It's, each author or each reader has his own point of view. You don't need to understand the full complexity. Like this, we had the same from databases. When that code started in 70, he said that we need a representation of data that everybody can understand. That was his point of view. That's why he created the relational model. So now, if you look at the database today, has such a complexity that no one understands. And the database manager does not understand the database. He manages the database, but does not understand the complexity of the representation. Why? Because the database is used by point of view. Point of view means I am the accountant manager. I understand data from accounting point of view. I only see data relevant for accounting my way. I am the marketing manager. I use the same data, but I see them from a marketing point of view. I don't care from the accountant point of view. I am the sales manager. I see the same data my way. So the another notion that you miss is point of view. So the big picture gets simplified because according to my point of view, I only see what I'm interested in, the way I can make sense of it. I don't see whatever is not interesting to me. Now, in culture, we were discussing at lunch, we have this problem. I have my own culture today, man. I want to improve my culture. So I want to know something that I don't know. What do I do? If I only stay on what I know, I never learn something more. So how do I go? How do I make a compromise between you should follow my profile at the same time you should give me something outside of my profile? So I don't know that I was interested in Ur civilization, but once I stumble into it, I may be interested. So the problem is there are several ways to get to information. One way very common today is search. Search means Ur, Mesa, Tel. I mean, somehow I can formulate what I want to find. I find it, and which is very good for some respect. The major issue is I never find what I'm not looking for. That's the main issue. The other notion is presentation, like traditional website by museum, also your website, you present me your information. So you present me your information means I can discover something I didn't know that exists. Now, later I will tell you some example. Here there are two problems. If the information is too complex, I don't understand what your site is too complex. It's very difficult to read your homepage. Very difficult. Second problem, I don't understand, I may not understand the language that you use, which is happens also with your site. So I see a lot of complex information. I just, if I'm not in the field, I don't understand what you are telling me. So I cannot really choose. I give you, I don't show you the example, but you know your website, you know that kaleidoscope is the most interesting piece of information for me. It took me half an hour to discover there was kaleidoscope. First of all, because it's placed down in the page. Secondly, because the name kaleidoscope may be fancy to you, but means nothing to me. For me, kaleidoscope is the most interesting part. If you go ahead, another example, which I show you from the Archaeological Museum of Taranto, which is a beautiful museum. Okay, they have an index like Taranto in the prehistory, Taranto before the Romans, Taranto during the Roman, Taranto after the Roman, and then there is Ricciardi collection. What is Ricciardi collection? How can you call something Ricciardi collection? It means what to Ricciardi, maybe, or to them. How can you? And then they have object on displays. Everybody imagines what you show in the museum. No, these are the best objects. What everybody else call highlights. Actually, that, of course, is the most important. So giving access to information is not easy because there is an interplay between what I know, what you know. So you should not represent your information. You are speaking about your info. So I ask you for your website. I know nothing about the civilization. Where do I start? What is potentially more interesting to me? Of course, if you have different audiences, you have different problem, of course. But communicating info is not the same as representing it. It's another point. It's a point of view, if you want. The point of view. So you can. I'm not saying throw away your organization, but on top of your organization, try to organize point of view. Point of view means I am a reader. Where do I start? And by the way, you don't have linear path in your, because once I access information, linear path means next. There is no next in your site. Next means I don't want to think about. Give something like old civilization, next. Okay, through 10 pieces of note, I get something. So, okay, the way to access information is searching. Next, so follow links. Next, going next. The other one is query. The difference between query and search is query is more organized and more precise. Query is give me all the object of the civilization, find that place made of this material and related to this problem. This is a query. Search is Buccellati, I don't know, semiotics of language is more abstract. All of them are useful. All of them are useful. So they should coexist. They should coexist in a good, because they should coexist because not just for the user profile, but for the user purpose. If I know exactly what I'm looking for, I do a query. If more or less I know, I do a search. If I'm just a generic interest, give me a path, give me a linear path, give me. So multilinearity does not exclude linearity. Otherwise, it's not non-linearity. Multilinearity does not mean non-linearity. It should mean multilinearity. Now, if you have, then we have another problem. If you have 100 linear paths, how do I choose the right one for me? That's the other problem. Now, think philosophically, indexes in traditional books are not very important unless it's a huge tome. I mean, in general, you start reading the book or you turn pages, you find what you want. Indexes in a website is everything. Your own page is an index, basically. And your index is very difficult to read. It's very difficult to make sense of it, unless it makes sense to you. To me, it took me, and I am a professional information designer, it took me a while to figure out what it's about. In index, it's very difficult. So beside content, we have indexes, means representing the way to access the information. It's not the information, but it's the way to access the information. And you should pay more attention to indexes, because indexes are the first thing that people look at and say, okay, I start with an index. Now, the problem of the index is relevance. Is everything there relevant to me? Semantic makes sense. From a semantic point of view, does everything make sense to me? Of course, that depends also to my profile. I think something there in your index makes sense for you, but may make little sense for a normal reader. The third issue is language. Which language do you use in the index? And which is in general, we were discussing before our lunch. Archaeology has a tradition of strange use of language. In the sense, not always it's clear what they think I should know. I give you some example. If you go to a museum in Italy, I was saying before, red vase with black figure, red vase for black figure. You see at the time, is this a way to index an object? What does it mean? I can see, unless I'm daltonic, I see the colors. So what's the message? If you tell me something is red vase with black figure, what does it mean? So the language that you use to describe something is as important as the semantics. I'm not conflicting with the deep semantic or deep meaning, but the problem is that when you put something there in display, the language used to describe the object or the part is crucial. It's not a trivial issue. There is nothing objective level. There is always subjective level. It's always something that you decide to use. I give you another example. All the Italian museum, they call oinokoe, oinokoe, oinokoe. If you don't know what's oinokoe, it's your problem. For the first time, I found in Sibari Archaeological Museum, a wonderful director. He wrote vase to verse for wine, parenthesis, oinokoe, which makes sense because 95% of the people understand what's vase for wine. Oinokoe means, okay, you call it oinokoe, but so the way you describe something is the language that you use in the index is crucial. If you have different audiences, you have a problem, of course, because different audiences may use different names for the same object, or they can use different codes. So you have two problems. Maybe the concept is unknown to your reader, or the concept is known, but they use different languages. We were discussing at the lunch. If I say this is the Virgo with the Jesus child, so the content is known in all Western culture. Maybe for a Japanese or the notion of Virgo with the Jesus child, the concept is not known. So you have two problems when you create an interface. Is the concept known to my reader? And the second problem is, if the content is known, actually we have two problems. Either the content is known or not known. If it is known, you have the problem of language. How do I convey the concept? If the concept is not known, cuneiform writing. Can you write cuneiform writing or not on an interface? Now, we have two issues. Either the people know the idea, but they use different names, or they have no idea what's a cuneiform writing. If they have no idea what's a cuneiform writing, you have two problems. you must use an indirect name there and explain the notion of cuneiform writing. So I don't have solutions. I only give you the problems. I worked several times. I mean, we did a lot of work with cultural heritage institutions. So I didn't follow my curriculum, but for different reasons, we did a lot of application for cultural heritage institutions, including Qumran. And we had to convey the Qumran concept to 18 European countries for school kids. So we found the problem. Not everybody was acquainted with the notion of what is the ancient Bible, what is there. Of course, Europe, I mean, we didn't work with Africa or Japan, so China. So there was the easiest, but still there is a different culture. So we need to convey sometimes difficult Jewish traditional concept to school kids in Europe. So we have to face all this problem, and there is no silver bullet. You have to work on it, do it once and do it better, do it once and do it better. But this is one of the issues. Again, the concept may be not known or is known with different wording. Even more dangerous if it is known with different interpretation. Now, I think in archaeology it does not exist, but for field like history, that's very, I mean, if I say Holocaust, today everybody understands what I'm talking about. If I say Armenian Holocaust, not everybody may agree with even the terminology or the concept. That does not exist. So it's a complex issue and there is no easy solution. So I think the idea of creating an overall frame for information representation, multilinearity, multi-level is very important. I think information science is different. You are content authors, mainly. I think for information design, you should get someone also which is not exactly, does not know all that you know. So you can look at the same information from a more neutral as an outsider. Because outsider can help you understand the point of view, a complex point of view, or different point of view. So what you do is, I think, is interesting development within information science as overall. And the purpose, I think, is very important, but I can add something more. You do this for the Ur culture. What about the Hittite culture or the Egyptian ancient culture? So once you blend, which is a problem for me, I'm not in the field. If you look at another civilization, you find similar concept, but then use different terminology, different chronology, different dates, different things. So another, if you want, even more larger issue is once you put two different teams trying to share info for the reader, what do we do? Even chronology are different. You read something Egyptian, typically they say 12 dynasty, 11 dynasty. I mean, I should know, but I don't remember when it's the 10th dynasty or the 9th. I don't want to be blamed because I don't remember when was the 9th. Okay, prehistory, history, more or less I know. But by the way, we know in Western culture, I don't know if in other culture they have the same idea. I don't remember 9th history. Or when in Italy, we typically say empire, Republic, Roman Republic, Roman Empire. Is this well known? When I read the Chinese history, I probably understand what they are saying because I don't relate to their way to express chronology. So even something like chronology is, when translated from culture to culture, becomes something. So I think all these issues are open. There is no standard solution. The solution is to take multiple points of view and to work on each point of view, optimizing each point of view. The result will be a mess, but who cares of the mess? Because no one sees the mess. Each one reads according to one of the point of view. Okay, I think this is it, and I have my slides now. I will rework my I will rework my contribution. It's totally different from what I had.
7 dicembre.
Sant'Ambrogio, which is relevant also for Milanese culture. Worldwide, Sant'Ambrogio means nothing.
Professor, first of all, my compliments for this so wide overview of the subject. And please correct me if I'm wrong, because the way the information is shared with potential users depends also on the target of this. The target.
Yeah, the target, yes.
I mean, a good starting point maybe for this, for solving the issue, for understanding which is my marketing strategy, and in few words, which are my target, who I want to be, to take a look at my website. So, for instance, I would say, of course, if you create the content. I had the same issue when I developed my website for my law firm. I'm a content writer, so I was a lawyer that I was writing in lawyerese for lawyers. The point is, my opinion, please, Professor, correct me if I'm wrong. If I want to get the attention of kids on or young people, youngsters to watch my website, I should use a language, different home pages maybe that selection information in a language that is more appropriate for catching youngster attention. Or of course, you have from another point of view, there are another target group are the scholars like you, which is somehow a target is much easier to get for you. It's a physiological. Another point is a third group would be normal people that that should be let's say find a way to when in peacetime, when it would be possible to come to have curiosity and come and see the play. So a first suggestion, in my opinion, this Professor correct me if I'm wrong, would be to create a home page with potential 3 different home pages that address to normal people, to kids potential, or youngsters, and to scholars, which is there are 3 different auditoriums. So the backbone of the website would be your actual job, which is scientific production. But the way it is shared, in order to grant true accessibility, it depends on the way it is explained to the others. This is a personal opinion, and
yeah, again,
I'd like to have your opinion on that.
no, the problem is absolutely well stated. Again, the solution is complex. I'll give you some example. In many touristic sites, in Italy, I've seen also in Japan, once say, I want to visit Tuscany. And they start saying, you want to see the northeast middle of the south? I don't know. If I don't know Tuscany, you start asking me, I don't know which one I want. I mean, do something else. Tell me something. How do I know? So the notion of the is not only is a profile in general sense, but profile of specific knowledge. A normal person in Italy can make sense of north, south, or middle. If you come from somewhere else, I don't know what I mean. So do you want culture, prehistoric history? I don't know what I want. So there is no, the profiling is a complex issue on its own. So I agree with you totally. The problem is defining the target is not easy. Once I know the target, what do I do? 10 on page is impossible. No one does it in the end. What do I do? One possibility is I create a more or less neutral on page, and then I create a specific section for specific readership. So for example, in your case, it could be, this is a standard general presentation to a good target. I'm not saying everyone, a good target, which is not really professional. And then you have the section professional, where you put all the more professional information. And then you have the section introduction, where you put the more introductory material. Another solution, I did this for a university website. I did my life 100 website probably. So another solution we found for university, which is typical, now it's less popular. It was typical is profiling indexes. In the sense, if you are a student who want to enroll at university, this is your index. If you are a student already enrolled in this university, this is an index. If you are a professor looking for a job at this university, this is your index. So creating same material, but different indexes according to who you are. So if you want to find a job at university, you don't want to read all the stuff about students. You want to read that part. Another possibility I like a lot in cultural literature for the people know, you start with the highlights. Show me your best. And then let's discuss the rest. Which are not just mean images, means whatever you have. Show me whatever is the most interesting. So if I know nothing about the Urkesh civilization, start showing me your best. And then I navigate. From there, I choose the path, maybe. I choose, once I find something interesting. So there is absolutely important to find the target of the readership. Although the notion of target is not so easy sometimes, because I can be an expert in cultural heritage by know nothing about Middle Eastern culture. So I know nothing about archaeology in general, is another target. So it's not, the solution again must be opportunistic, somehow, the start. In terms of, I think the most difficult part is the multiple facet of what you show as a node, because that node, let's say that node corresponds to an object. But the way you describe the object, again, is depending on the target. You can describe it archaeologically, where you found it, all the data about the archaeological finding. You can describe it aesthetically. You can describe it from a religion point of view. You can describe it from a linguistic point of view. So you should also consider the target as a multiple description. Of course, you may start with the neutral description. The problem neutral description is not good for no one. It's good for everybody, but not really good for no one because it's so generic. And I think in some cases you have the generic description. The same. Okay. Basically said, don't call it a red base with black figures, but even a generic description. So you may start, many museums, what they do, they start a generic description, they have a specialized description according with the target. So now, one point of view is, if I am an archaeologist, I can say, show me only the archaeological description of the object, forget about the rest. So for each object, I see all your archaeological data. If I am a sociologist, even if I am a professional, but I am a sociologist, show me the description from a sociological point of view or a religious point of view. Now, if I want, I can look at the other, but the default is according to my profile. My profile is religious. Tell me something. So the solution is never easy, but just understanding the problem improves the solution. So understanding that the problem, but don't try to convey everything at once. Only you that create the material see everything. For everybody else, giving a way of reading the material. So somebody, I wrote something, I don't remember. Readership is not like representing information. Readership is a process. Representing is that. Representing is there. But when I'm reading, I'm on the move. Books are very tricky because everybody say books are linear. Books are not linear. Narratives are linear. You read from page 1 to last pages. If you take an archaeology book, do you ever read an archaeological book from page 1 to the end? Never. You move around, you cross, you look at the index, you look at the picture, you find the cross-reference. Yeah, sometimes I read the footnotes by themselves. So books are, mostly complex books are never used, the readership is never, it jumps from one place to another. Another point, I think it's important, your site somehow is missing is serendipity. I stumbled into something I didn't expect, and that was interesting, which is the pleasure of the museum. I remember when we were working for museum, we interview a visitor to the museum, and we asked them, do you prepare yourself before the museum? The most expert visitor, they told us, I never prepare because I go there, I want to be surprised. Later, I read the catalog, after. And somehow archaeology is the same. Give me surprise, give me something, then I read the catalog. Of course, the other approach is I read all the catalog, I know what I want. But most of the readership is by surprise, which is the pleasure of going to, why you go to bookstore instead of looking in Amazon? Because the pleasure is I move around, I discover something I didn't expect. So there are several ways of reading, but the most important service is serendipity. Someone who knows nothing about your work. And that's why, honestly, in your site, the kaleidoscope for me was the most interesting part. No, from there I can read the rest. From there I can read the rest. But so what are we talking about? Before you telling me where you excavate, how deep, I mean, show me objects, show me something, tell me something, and then I can be, maybe I'm interested in your method of work, I may be interested in religion, I may be interested in aesthetics, but tell me something interesting, which is the ability with human narrative. You start saying something interesting, from there you move. So I have no solution. I just tell you, the approach is very interesting. Your information is very complex, very interesting, very difficult to convey. But that, I mean, the approach, it must be done. If you want, it must be done. Because archaeology is too important to be left to archaeologists. This is a famous quotation, I don't remember from whom, but archaeology is too valuable to be left to archaeologists, honestly. I think honestly, yeah. I honestly think like this. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. We will try. That's your password, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Just a second.
Yes.
We are setting the slide so everybody in the room can see you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
The caps lock is on, it says.
Thank you. Do you have any slide, Luca?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Sure.
Vuoi il codice, Michele?
Sì, grazie Marco, grazie.
823
Sì,
1804
sì.
3492.
Okay. Luca, can you hear me? Marco?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Can you hear Professor Peyronel? Okay, great.
Okay. So, buon pomeriggio a tutti. Hello to everyone. And thank you a lot, Politecnico. And of course, I thank you a lot also Giorgio, Marilyn, and Iko for inviting me to participate in this stimulating discussion. And I remember that some years ago, many of us were at Polimi talking about Syrian cultural heritage, community engagement at Mozan, and we discussed how to create ties between sites, local people, and archaeological teams in the difficult times of the Syrian crisis and war. And I think that the work of the Urkesh team has been, and it still is, one of the best examples of public archaeology in Syria and in Western Asia during this troubled period. And therefore, I'm very happy to be again here at your university to exchange ideas and on another relevant topic of scientific research, that is the digital dimension of archaeological data and the publication and diffusion to the scientific community. Only I'm sorry that it wasn't possible for me to join you in person. As George already told you, I was back from Iraq just a week ago, and I'm still in quarantine for a couple of days. So let's start offering some consideration and pointing out some questions on the floor for discussion on the digital discourse proposal and on the digital conceptual dimension in relation with the Urkesh Global Record. I would like to concentrate mainly on three themes for the discussion, three topics, leaving aside the problem of how the scientific publication can interact with a more general communication to the public. That was the main topic of it was the main topic that was already discussed by my colleague before. So I will concentrate on the scientific digital publication. The first theme is related to the big data challenge and the question of datification. The second one is related to the problem of open access and open science principles. And the third topic will be related to the problem of geospatial context of our archaeological excavation and how we can use the GIS tools for the publication. Let's start with the big data challenge. The constant enhancement of digital application for producing, storing, and manipulating data has brought the focus into data-driven and data-led science in the humanities. At the same time, in recent decades, archaeology has embraced digitization. As a consequence, more recently, we as archaeologists began to ask to themselves if a big data approach can be applied to archaeology from both a theoretical and practical point of view. This recent attention addressed to big data in archaeology is, of course, due to the transdisciplinary nature of archaeology that usually deals with data acquired in the long term, even decades, as the case of many excavations in Western Asia, for example, from Ebla to Urkesh to Katna and other sites, at a different scale that could be regional or local, and from different fields research groups, also at different times that have collected data, hence producing a large amount of information to be processed and analyzed. The definition of many kind colleagues on big data, and I quote, big data refers to data sets whose size is beyond the ability of typical database software tools to capture, store, manage, and analyze. On the other hand, as pointed out by Boyd et al. In 2012, again I quote, big data is not only about data that is big, but it is about a capacity to search, aggregate, and cross-reference large data sets. So big data's high volume, velocity, and variety cannot be considered in an absolute manner, but in a relative way. using big data means working on the possibility to work with the full or close to the full set of data, namely with all the data available from different disciplines that can be useful to solve a question. So this is the equation with big data as all data. And we arrived now to the problem of globality that was already stressed, for example, in the first presentation of Georgia and then also by Marilyn. It is clear that digitization has changed archaeology, deeply increasing exponentially the amount of data that could be processed. But as stressed by Giorgio, the act of digitization, the turning analog information in computer-readable format, does not by itself involve datafication. Datafication must have an even more profound impact on archaeology, challenging the foundation of our established methods of measurement and providing new opportunities. To datafy means to transform objects, processes, context, etc., in a quantified format, so they can be tabulated and analyzed. And so datafication fits with a big data approach and relies on the new forms of quantification and associated data mining techniques that permit more sophisticated mathematical analysis to identify non-linear relationships among data, allowing us to use the information, for instance, for massive predictive analysis. In other words, we can produce a flow of data that involve location interactions, relations between finds and contexts, and among different kinds of artifacts and ecofacts. A flow of data that the archaeological community should have available. And this is possible, of course, only through digital publication and open databases. So the main question for me, and I would like to discuss with you, is how we can face this challenge, and in the specific, how the Urkesh Global Record intends to approach this challenge. And in relation with the fundamental question of globality of data use, how can the extremely large amount of information processed by the for publication, from digital publication by the archaeological teams in a reasonable time span, of course, because this work is really time consuming. We have seen, for example, in the Marilyn's presentation, that only the A16 digital book that includes, if I remember well, 8 squares, is formed by more than 4 million records that can be processed and then can be digitized, of course. How we can face with this problem, and how you have faced this problem in your project. Can we use, or could your project consider to use, for example, crowdsourcing that was used, for example, in many projects of digitization of museum materials? Now let's come to the second aspect that is, of course, also correlated. That is the topic of open access and open science in the large definition of UNESCO. Open science should embrace a diversity of knowledge, practices, workflows, languages, research outputs, and research topics that support and needs an epistemic pluralism of the scientific community as a whole, diverse research communities and scholars, as well as the wider public and knowledge holders, beyond the traditional scientific community, including local community and social actors from different countries and regions. So the open sites should play a significant role in ensuring equity among researchers from developed to developing countries, enabling fair and reciprocal sharing of scientific inputs and outputs and equal access to scientific knowledge to both producers and consumers of knowledge, regardless location, nationality, gender, race, and so on. I would like to discuss about this because when we realize this such very important project of digital publication, we have to taking into account also the from one side the usability of the database of the digital publication, and also how this database can contribute to open science in terms of creation of network, circulation of information, giving us the possibility to have a direct access to the data from our excavation. So I think that availability and usability of data is, of course, fundamental and is, how to say, part of the ethic of our job and in general of the archaeology in every part of the world. And in this way, I think that is very important that we have from one side the possibility to give access of data from the wider to the wider scientific community. That is the main aim of your project, but at the same time we have to think about and also to plan to have some tools that enable also other kind of readership to have knowledge about the very specific information that we have published in the digital way. So I would like to discuss with you the new possibility that is offered by web publication and how these web publication contribute to open science. And finally, few words about the geospatial framework of analysis. I am leading a national project on the rising and fall of the archaic state of Ebla in the early Bronze Age northern Syria, that was called Big Data and Early Archives. And for our analysis, we are using geo-referenced framework of analysis, so mainly a web GIS and an open source GIS that I think that give us the possibility to recover the physical dimension in a virtual way of the archaeological context. I have seen that you don't use at the moment a GIS in this publication, digital publication of the Urkesh excavation. So I would like to discuss if you consider also the possibility to have some georeferenced environment of your data in the future. And of course, I know that you cross the border of traditional approach in archaeology looking at new digital paths of research well before the introduction and diffusion of GIS in archaeology. But I would like also to see now, what do you think about these kind of tools, and how these tools can be used also in a kind of more general communication about the excavation. We are preparing for our project a web GIS that is accessible to the general public, where we selected very specific information that was, of course, rearranged, avoiding technical terms and avoiding more detailed information. But from this web GIS, you can, how to say, move on the physical space of the ancient sites in northern Syria. And I think that is a very has a very high potential in the communication strategies. So I think that this is the three main things that I have selected for a common discussion about the digital discourse, and especially the conceptual dimension of the digital publication of archaeological excavations. I found very interesting the epistemological approach that you have adopted. So not only discussing about how to put our information in a website, how we can create a relational database, but a reflection about how is the digital information and how is the relation between the digital information and the physical reality of the archaeological context. And I also found very interesting the possibility to have a kind of digital narratives, the possibility to follow the relation between data that has some kind of objectivity and the interpretation, so the arguments. That means the possibility to establish and to follow the different steps that from recovery of data lead us to the reconstruction of the past and interpretation of the past. And I thank you very much, and thank you again.
Mi senti? Guarda, adesso abbiamo l'interferenza con questo. Okay. Allora, io non ero schedulato, pare che si riesca a dire in italiano, per questo slot, ma ne approfitto del fatto che... Oh yeah. So I wasn't scheduled. I wasn't scheduled. That's quite easy. I wasn't scheduled to speak at this point. But since Lucio unfortunately cannot join us, I take advantage to just take a few words with Iko's permission before he will give us a final overview and also response. The reason I thought I would take this opportunity is because of the great interest of what the respondents have said, and the beauty especially with regard to Paolo's comment, is that I agree profoundly on certain things and I disagree on the same things. It's quite interesting. So I'd like to just take a few moments really to say this. I hope we may have an opportunity at some other time to speak at length, more at length about these things. Will had to leave, I guess, or he is going, okay. Well, maybe I'll wait to speak about Will's. The running theme that has been missing is really the importance of the argument of linking the argument with the data, to which Luca referred at the end. And that was really the main sort of goal, in effect, of what we intend to do. Now, this is brought out in some ways by some of Paolo's points. And there are so many and of such interest that, but I can only take up two, the linearity and the audience. You're quite right, and I like the idea of the multi-planar sort of image or metaphor, in effect, which is what we were also referring to using the term tracks. Because you're right, those are planes that are running concurrently, and you were speaking of points of view. So in a way, that is what we were saying with the tracks. So you're quite right about that. You're also right, and that's a very good point, that reading is essentially linear, that it is a experience, as you said, that cuts across the planes. Now, where I maybe, I don't know if I disagree or I just want to reformulate in different ways what you were saying. Well, it seems to me that what intersects are not the planes, or at least anyway, that's what I am trying to do, is not to have the planes intersect, but to have the reading experience, that is the linearity of the reading experience intersecting the image which I had in this plane were linked by arrows, which insert pieces of information or of argument from some of the parallel tracks. So what is intersecting the planes is really the reading, while the planes are in themselves have their own linearity in my concept. And that's why I use the term discourse. It's as if the planes discourse, using this as a verb, with each other. And they are interacting and intersecting, but not as planes. They're intersecting in terms of the lines of the reading that happens between them. So that's one point. All of these points we should really discuss much more at length, but I can only mention it very, very briefly here. The second point is the target audience, to which also Will referred. We are very clear, it's not a problem at all to me. You said that you suggest the problem rather than a solution. I have the perfect solution for that. Also to what Michael is the name of it was saying. We only have the scholars in mind. We really don't have you in mind. We don't have, it's purely the reason why we were delighted.
Archaeology is too important to be left to archaeologists.
Absolutely. That's why Paolo, that's why I'm a historian and a linguist. But the point is that we really, the reason why we were eager to have you and the others talk with us is because what we are proposing is a model of interaction between data and argument. You never mentioned the term argument. You kept talking about information. Information is not our goal, it is our main goal, and we have plenty of the database embedded in the system. But the main goal of our meeting, though, has to do with argument. That is how to interlace argument with the data. And Luca referred to that at the end particularly. So we really have the purely the scholar in mind. It's purely a scholarly goal to represent not only information, but also interpretation, as Luca was saying. We want to represent the interpretation of the excavator, but at the same time showing the data globally. Globality for us means that every single observation that has ever been made is recorded referentially. So it's referentially means that it's in our written record. It's not just in the physical record. And this means that we achieved in this way, we think, the discourse among the various planes. So the argument and the interaction between argument and the between arguments is very important, or in fact is the essence of what I'm trying to do. And sorry, just one moment. Well, in connection with what Will was saying at the beginning, in fact, but it also ties in with the current topic. We were saying with relationship to what Paolo had mentioned. The audience, in a sense, the first audience is ourselves as the scholars who write the argument. And it's the only case in which one can speak, I think, of a definitive publication. At the end of every day, we have a final publication that cannot be changed because the observation as recorded is the only objective data that we have. See, of course, we have the objects after they have been excavated, but that's not archaeology. That's really a art historical or whatever analysis of the individual objects. The context, the emplacement, the contact association of elements in the ground disappears the moment this has been observed and extricated from the ground. And that observation is the only positive thing and objective thing that we have. So globality for me means precisely the totality of observations that has ever been made, but not presented, in this case, I think it goes along with what you were saying, not presented as a dump, but as a coherent whole. And the coherent whole that is also based on a narrative, namely on a sequential presentation of the data. And that's what both Mary and I showed, this segmented narrative, as we were calling it. With regard to what Luca was saying, that too was very interesting and important. I think we all quite agree with what you are saying. And I think we can just qualify a little bit from my point of view, and Iko will do it even better than I can. In terms of georeferencing, one thing that we have been doing long before GIS has been a full volumetric, that's what we call a volumetric record, which in a sense is really, it seems to be an early form, but still now a valid form of georeferencing. And that is present for every single item that we have recorded. So there is that, and it is part of the datafication, as you called it, which is the transfer of the information and of the data on a big data scale into a quantifiable form. Well, with regard to open access, my goal has been definitely to have everything fully accessible to everyone, but in effect to every scholar. Again, I want to emphasize the fact that it's not that we disregard the children or the kids, or which in fact we do, but not in this website and not within the framework of the goal that I've been setting out today. So one reason why both Lerke and Jonah spoke this morning of publishing the website. Now, what we mean by publishing is that the website has to have an internal coherence before it can be made public, before it can be published. And that's what we are aiming to achieve. The Urkesh website is actually open. That is, we don't have passwords, but the point is that we have never advertised it, so we assume nobody ever looks at it. Because it's not really coherent yet. It's not fully coherent, and to that extent, it's not really published. Bibliographical websites, we have opened the archaeology one, and we have not published the one on religion, because one on religion has not reached the level of coherence that the archaeological one had. So that it's our goal to reach a level of internal coherence that justifies and makes it possible to open. So when you got to the kaleidoscope point, and I'm thrilled that you saw it, because I thought it was one of the least important parts of the of the website. In a way, it was a teaser, precisely trying to, because the first kind of page or section of the general website is actually the overview, where that is in a sense meant also for non-scholars in effect. The kaleidoscope was supposed to be some of the most interesting objects that everybody would understand immediately without any particular preparation. So, but it is really kind of there. It's not sufficiently integrated with the rest, and that in that sense, I'm saying it's not sufficiently coherent yet, the site to really open it, even though we've been working on it for 30 years, but it is still in the making. After all, I am from Milan, and the Duomo is still not finished. So, okay, so these were some of the comments that came to mind, and I really want to thank all three of you, Will and Paolo and Luca, for your, Luca in particular, because you were at one point shut out from the because the internet stopped working. So thank you for your patience. So now I think if Iko wants to come and wrap up our meeting. In the preface, the book on the critique is dedicated to Iko, and the dedication says that because he is present at creation, and which was a famous sentence, and indeed he has been present and continuously present at the continuous creation, continuing creation of all of this that we're talking about.
So it's my task to wrap up a bit some of the questions that we've been talking about. And the worth and merit of website publishing are some of my thoughts, and I'll also add some of the themes that came up as well over the day on my own take on this. I think that one nice metaphor for what we're doing, what we're talking about, is this one. How bricks, which we were talking about over lunch, are in a certain sense interchangeable, like the pieces of knowledge. Obviously, the content of the books are not interchangeable, but as presented in a library, there is a mass of data. There's a mass of differentiated pieces that one has in front of us. And out of that, one plucks out information and builds something, which is then at the level of discourse, or the narrative. This is one of the themes that we've been talking about today. I think that the real challenge is then this would be another monograph, let's say, this this image of the temple, of the palace as built with bricks, among other things. I think that the real challenge, a lot of people are using digital and going ahead. The real question is, how can we really exploit this digitality, which does justice to the medium, as we heard this morning? Because we are using it, lots of people are using it, lots of people are using it very well, but it is fundamentally a different medium. Sort of a banal parallel was, a calculator, a pocket calculator, which changed people's lives because everything was so much faster. But all it does is do what we were doing before a lot faster and a lot more precisely. There isn't really a justice which can be done to the pocket calculator using it in a different way. But the question is then really, can the digital medium change us as scholars and on a broader level society, but and society's interaction with knowledge? But what we're focused on here now is the scholarly aspect. So I'd like to make just a few points. And the real question is, how is this sort of publication represent this better mode of discourse? And
sorry
how are we better scholars when we do use these tools? So the multilinearity and the nodes is something we've been talking about. Also, the searchability within the text allows for a very quick finding of the correct nodes. And in a certain sense, that's what one does in PDFs. One is trying to take something which is almost paper and almost force it into a multilinear mode of thought by jumping from page to page, looking for specific things. And I think it was a very nice point about the serendipity and going to the museum. I think that that's not really an aim of what we're doing, but I think that by making it available, that then searches could stumble across information. And I would have to also disagree in that when you search, you don't find things that you're not looking for. That's not exactly, when you query, you don't find things you're not searching for. But in a certain sense, you do find, because when in searches which are exposed to a totality of data beyond what you're looking for. So if one were to search within the Urkesh website for maybe food and eating.
You are not on Zoom.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes. Also for the
Yeah, of course, I'm sorry. I'm not seeing them. Yeah, share screen, there it is. Sorry, I'm used to it someplace else. Okay, here we go.
But they can hear.
They can hear me, okay. Okay, sorry for the Zoom audience, for my virtual audience. I was just showing, these are the bricks. This is the discourse in sort of the physical discourse representing the printed monograph and the digital, which speaks of the exploitation of the digital, which the question is the exploitation of digitality, which does justice to the medium. It's still the same palace, but represented through the digital medium, and how is this different? So I was going to the searching. If you were to search in the Urkesh website, in the website itself for, let's say, Urkesh and food, then one would come across things related to food. If one would put in Urkesh and food in Google, for example, one would still find those references because the Urkesh Global Record is part of the indexed mass of data that Google trolls through. But one would also find, for example, there's a pizzeria in Paderborn, which is called the Urkesh Pizzeria, and it's actually the site of Urkesh. It's one of the very nice echo of cultural heritage that that it must be people from the site or even workmen who fled as refugees. I don't know who it is, but they fled as refugees and opened a pizzeria and used the website to copy seal impressions and images that they then put on the walls and put on their menu. So it's quite, if anybody of you ever ends up in Paderborn, I can recommend the pizzeria. So there is a certain element of serendipity in searchability when it's not just within the website, as opposed to this query. So what are some of the challenges? One of the things we really haven't talked too much about is the recognition that is given to digital publications. And that's really a problem, especially for sort of younger scholars and students who are starting their first publications, because website publishing or digital publication, as an even stronger term, is still not considered a real scholarly contribution. And there are some reasons for that. And rather than just pushing to say it should be, I think that we also have to confront, and in our own work, I would suggest we have to see what the point is, why it is not given the same valence. And I think there are four main points. One is a lack of interoperability. So there's a range of totally different interfaces. A book is a book is a book. I mean, you open it up and there are pages, whether they be A4 or A5, that's about as big as the difference of interface that you get. Whereas with websites, there are a wide variety of ways of accessing these websites that tend to be very, very different among themselves, and lead to a lack of understanding as to the real impact of the work that has been done. It requires, there's not a, you don't feel how thick the book is or how heavy it is in order to judge the quality, which shouldn't be a criteria, but often is at first glance. The second is that there's sort of a lack of finality, that these versions of websites means that it's finished, but it's not really finished. And so at what point is there closure to the product that a scholar produces? There's also tends to be a lack of referentiality, that the target audience is often then somehow not given the same tools to go beyond, perhaps because of the use of hypertext, of hyperlinks, then there really tend not to be footnotes, almost ironically. And I think that leads to, on a first glance, leads to a lack of depth and a lack of scholarship, or at least the thought that it is a lack of scholarship. And also longevity. I don't know if this has happened to you, but I've quoted several times websites, even scholarly websites for individual excavations, not to single them out because they're certainly not the only case, but the Troy excavation had a lovely website, which no longer exists. And which I did end up quoting as a URL. So there's that also sense of a lack of longevity. I wanted to also bring up a couple of points from the talks today, sort of referring to further challenges. Lerke spoke of critical thinking, contemplation, conception, cognitive connections, hermeneutics as aspects of deep reading. And the real question, which she was also posing, is, are these lost? And how can we give the space for those kinds of things in the way that we formulate the websites? And Professor Paolini was talking about the nodes, and he didn't actually use the term black hole, but in a certain sense, that was my sense, that it was a singularity around which data collects, but one can never ascribe any data directly to that singularity, because at that moment, you are just adding a layer externally. Any kind of definition is then adds a layer which is beyond the node itself. And I think that one way, sort of the linguistic way, the linguistic definition of this knowledge creation is agglutinative. And I think that that's really one of the main strengths of the Urkesh Global Record, that there is a way for authors to add, not to a higher level discourse, it's not a collection of essays, but really to add directly on that very first initial layer of data that surrounds the singularity of the node. And I think that deep reach, the way that authors by adding don't just add external layers to an always growing sort of ball of string surrounding the singularity, but they can add at any level. I think that that's one of the strengths. And by having authors of different perspectives adding information at that level of node, that one approaches from a great distance, a totality of definitions. Now, a totality of definitions for the target audience, a totality of definitions for a very specific archaeological audience, because as was said before, these websites, because they're meant also as scholarly works, and because we're contributors, young scholars who are contributing to them, are hoping that then they are considered, they have a certain valence in the archaeological community and the scholarly community, and contribute to the body of work that we produce, that then what we are adding is very specifically relevant for the target audience. Will Raynolds was talking about how we can use the publication to mitigate the fact that we have little control over future outcomes, in terms of what another team would have to know were they to come to Mozan to excavate, and none of us were ever here. And to some extent, the question I think should be posed also, what do they really need? Hodder returning to Châteaubriand, I don't know if having more data about what Mellard had done would really have changed the approach. If anything, maybe sort of the blank slate where one was aware that something else had been written, that may have, in a certain sense, also not conditioned his approach and allowed him to go in a totally different direction. So I think one has to really think a little bit more about what would they really need. And then the last point that I have is just the point to add really to what Luca had mentioned about the geospatial, that it was talking about communication, visualization, and I think that's certainly true, and it's tied directly to the creation of scholarship. You know, the fact that distribution analysis is really possible only because of tools like GIS and those things. And specifically, sort of to answer quickly his question, while GIS is not directly a part of the global record, the geospatial information for each node is there available. And so in a certain sense, what we've created, looking at it purely from the perspective of somebody working in GIS, we've created the back end of data and onto which a GIS wrapper can be applied. Yeah, so those are my thoughts, and I think if there's more discussion, that would be wonderful. And for my part, thank you very much for your comments and for your interest and for the very interesting talks today. So I don't know, it's a bit late. Do we want to see if there's any general questions, not to me necessarily, but also from the Zoom audience? Let me see if there's somewhere I can. Is there, let's see, if there's any questions from the Zoom people, please send me I guess a chat would be the best, or wave. Otherwise, if there are any other questions.
Semmai Federico ripeti anche per quelli che sono collegati, che se lo riprendono noi accogliamo nella rivista per la pubblicazione dei loro contributi che ci interessano molto e diciamo salve il professor Paolini che deve consegnare entro il 7 dicembre.
Un riferimento culturale
Esatto.
per i milanesi, gli altri non lo sanno.
Esatto. Per gli altri vale la data del 15 gennaio.
Il 10 gennaio.
Inizia a massacrare, esatto.
Maria Justina Capito was saying that that it would be wonderful to publish the various talks in the journal, which I don't remember exactly the name, but and that in January was it 15th, that if it would be possible for January 15th to then prepare those for those who want to. So that we can continue, so that they can be in English or in Italian. Great.
I'm telling the subject matter of this issue of the journal.
May I share
Sure. Yes, please.
the link of the...
No,
stay.
No, I'm getting the subject matter of this issue of the journal. Il soggetto di questa è la transizione della rivista, del numero della rivista, la transizione digitale. Quindi i contributi di oggi sono per il numero, per l'ultimo numero della rivista del 2022. Del 2022, scusate. Mentre ci sarà un numero sulla parte più propriamente beni culturali, patrimonio, nel 2022. Su quello potrebbero andare i contenuti di ieri, ok? Mentre il numero ultimo del 2021 è dedicato alla transizione digitale, mi sembra quello che si detto oggi sia più che pertinente. Grazie. Ah sì, mando magari a te, Federico, mando a te i riferimenti relazionali. Tenete presente che è una rivista intersettoriale, sì, è una rivista intersettoriale, quindi valgono le regole di settore anche per quanto riguarda le note, per esempio, perché noi giuristi facciamo note a piedi pagina, esplicative, ci sono settori scientifici disciplinari che usano le note alla fine, noi li rispettiamo, anche perché questa è una rivista che sono i primi numeri, sono del 2021, e la candideremo per la scientificità della rivista per chi è interessato a partire dal secondo anno. Quindi per ora noi seguiamo rigorosamente ciascuno le sue linee, diciamo così, anche salvo ovviamente diciamo non dovete superare le 50 note, cose che valgono per tutti. Dopodiché speriamo di avere presto il riconoscimento della scientificità, ma una rivista nuova, una rivista che ha un profilo giuridico, ma che in realtà interessa i temi che interessano tutti noi e che possono avere un impatto anche nel mondo del diritto, ma poi ciascuno si di quello che sa, evidentemente. È diritto, ma è diritto politecnico, quindi una rivista che si occupa delle linee di confine, sia dal punto di vista sostanziale che anche di approccio. Ecco, questo è, quindi fateci arrivare quello che poi ci sono i referì, naturalmente. Questo comunque è il sito per poter leggere interamente i documenti, gli articoli bisogna iscriversi, quindi la prima passaggio se volete leggere la registrazione e basta, perché se non è aperto, la rivista sono quindi va bene? Grazie, grazie a tutti.
Grazie.
Tu hai scritto o no?